Hi, my name's Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony in E minor. I'd like to go through each of the movements of this famous orchestral work, exploring how it's put together, because I do believe that having some understanding of structure in music can greatly aid our appreciation and enjoyment of it. Now, Rachmaninoff was living in Dresden in 1906, and he started composing his Second Symphony round about the time that his second daughter Tatiana was born. I think he was putting to rest the ghosts of his first symphony with this work, because of course his first symphony caused him this deep depression because of the failure of its premiere. So 10 years later, here he is finally tackling the Second Symphony, and must have been a great joy to him when it was premiered in 1908. January 1908 in St. Petersburg, that the work became a success, and must have been sounded a personal note of triumph for Rachmaninoff. It's a long work, but an exciting and richly orchestrated romantic symphony, something along the lines of his second piano concerto a few years before. The first movement is in sonata form. And we begin with this lengthy introduction where we have this rather ominous sounding musical foreboding. We have these three ideas which make up this motto in this symphony, which keep coming back throughout the movements in various guises. A bit like, you could argue, Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, which also has a motto theme and shares the same key. Indeed, you can hear quite a lot of Tchaikovsky in this work. So we begin with this idea in the introduction in the cellos and basses. We have a wind chord, and then we have this beautiful idea on the violins. It sounds like tears falling. Then those ideas are repeated, but varied this time. And after the third repetition, we have this wonderful moment when that tears descending violin idea is heard in canon through the string section. Always sends a shiver down my spine when I hear that. Really beautiful. The music works to this rather Tristan-esque climax before we start the first subject proper, Allegro moderato, and the clarinets play this idea. Then the first violins, the first and seconds. So on. We have a new idea as well in that first subject group, which goes like this. And so on. We then have an exciting transition full of triplets, going the brass coming in, getting very loud, up to fortissimo. And then the second subject begins, this beautiful idea. Again, on the winds, first of all we hear this, oboes and clarinets. And so on. Very beautiful, ardent, passionate music. And that carries on in this rather beautiful way, and eventually it dies down. We have no real codetta. It's marked a repeat of the whole exposition, which not all conductors observe because of the length of the work, but I like it when it is repeated personally. Then we go into the mighty development. So much of awe and excitement in this development. We begin with this violin solo. And so on. That tears motif we heard in the introduction haunts this development. We have much of the first subject as well in this development, and eventually we come to this moment, meno mosso, where the music very much harkens back to the introduction. We hear those ominous chords on the introduction again, this time on the brass, and the tears idea again, that falling idea. Eventually we have this rhythmic idea on the violas, brings us to this almighty Tchaikovskyan climax, very perhaps reminiscent of Tchaikovsky's Pathétique symphony, and we start hearing these fanfares in the brass. This eventually takes us to the first subject again in the violins. And we're back in E minor, but you wouldn't really call it a recapitulation because the key doesn't settle there, and it's very different from the Exposition. So I still regard this as part of the development. Tchaikovsky does a very similar thing in the first movement of the Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. Perhaps Rachmaninoff was using that as his model. And then there's this wonderfully exciting, tragic moment at the end of this development. 3 Fs, extremely loud, punctuated by syncopated brass writing. Eventually that dies down and we hear the second subject. This time the recapitulation has begun proper. The second subject in the tonic major key, E major. That beautiful melody is heard again. The second subject really flowers here, perhaps even more than in the Exposition. And we come then to this exciting coda where once again that tear motif is referred to. We're working up to a mighty climax again and then dying down before we have this almighty thump on the penultimate beat of the movement in the cellos and basses. Although it's the scherzo of the symphony, the second movement, the Allegro molto, in form is more like a rondo, with the A section repeating at regular intervals throughout the piece. We begin quite unforgettably with this idea in the first and second. And over the top we have this melody on the horns, very much reminiscent of the Dies Irae theme, which of course haunts Rachmaninoff's music. Then the violins extend that. And so on. Also in this A section of this scherzo movement we have these triplet ideas, usually in the wind. That's a little motif that runs through each of the sections of this movement actually. Eventually, after a transition where we have the clarinets going, we come to this tender melody, which I call the B section. Very beautiful melody, one of those supremely romantic moments in this most romantic of symphonies. Eventually, via a short transition with those triplet ideas, we're back to a varied statement of the A section. Then we come to the trio of this movement, which in terms of the movement's form I describe as C. And we have this very contrapuntal, this part. With the seconds we begin with this idea. And so on. And then allied to that we have this rhythmic idea as well. That driving rhythm. So very different in tone, rather more agitated, anxious than the A and B sections. That triplet idea persists in this section as well. Da-da-da-da. Listen out for that. And then we come to this new part, which I call the D section at the heart of this movement. We have this festive march in the brass, when you hear the side drum there as well. It's almost as if we're walking through a parade of some description in this part of the movement. We then go back to that highly chromatic idea of the C section, slightly varied, and then we're back to the scherzo again, A, B, A. And then at the end of the movement we have a coda where we're reminded of that festive march, but in a somewhat darker timbre, and the movement ends in a rather ghostly, spectral way. The third movement is justly famous, a really beautiful piece of orchestral music, brimming with beautiful melodies. And it's actually very simple in terms of its structure. It's a ternary form movement, that is an A section, a contrasting B section, and a return to the A section in a somewhat varied form in this case. We begin with this very romantic melody. So that is, I guess, the main melody, but then we've got this beautiful melody on the clarinet which seems to go on forever. Rachmaninoff really was a true melodist, and that goes like this. And so on. A really lovely melody. I guess time seems to stand still at this point in the symphony. So beautiful. And then the violins take up that melody, and indeed the beginning melody as well. And eventually we go to the contrasting middle section of this movement, the B section. And here we're back to those that tear motif from the introduction. And then a new melody is revealed around that mournful idea from the introduction. Back to that, the tear motif. Leads us to this wonderful and glorious climax, fortissimo, and then eventually we go back to a restatement of the material from the A section, sometimes with those melodies combined, but also with the tears motif from the introduction retained as well. And there's a coda as well, and at the point of the coda there is this wonderful, we reach this wonderful resolution, and we hear those tears again from the introduction, and the music ends very quietly. The finale is a magnificent summing up of this symphony. It quotes all the movements we've heard so far, and it's got this driving energy and this boisterous, irrepressible energy about it. The first subject is essentially a march. We begin with a few bars of introduction. And then eventually we come to the first subject theme proper, which goes something like this. And so on. Da-da-da-da-da. Rather triumphant in nature. Eventually we come to this subsidiary idea in this group, which isn't really long enough to be treated as a subject in its own right. Which is in the minor mode. We hear it on the oboe first. And so on. Then we go back to the first idea, etc. Then by means of a transition, we go into this glorious, romantic, big tune. You know, a bit like the finale to the second piano concerto. And you get the sense when you hear this tune that this is going to be the one that's going to round off the whole symphony in some style. The melody goes like this. Carries on in a rather glorious way, and then we come to a brief codetta, only a few bars long but very significant, because we hear again the motto from the introduction of the first movement, those tear motifs. Etc. And underneath that we get a quote from the third movement, that opening beautiful melody. Etc. We're then into the development. The development is based more or less on that march idea. It's a lot darker in tone and more anguished. And we come back to those chords on the introduction as well, which we heard on the woodwind originally, but now on the brass. Also in this development, we get to this crashing climax where we hear these descending chromatic scales all over the orchestra, a bit like the pealing of bells. It really is a marvellous moment in this work. And that heralds the recapitulation. The first subject again, this time varied. More emphasis is given on subsidiary ideas. We hear that other idea in the first subject group, the more mournful minor key idea. We go back to the original march part idea and listen out for that quote there from the scherzo movement. And after a lengthy transition we go to the second subject for the final time, and this time it's in all its radiant glory, finishing off this marvellous symphony. And again we hear the tears motif near the end in a varied form. We then have a thrilling coda, which truly rounds off this magnificent symphony in some style. Thank you for Tidnid for suggesting that I look at this work. And if you have any suggestions for any other pieces you'd like me to look at, please put them in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Bye.